Two things. One is because we're in Newton, we have to wear masks in the church. So just a friendly reminder on that. Second is that after this evening's conversation, Michael will be selling copies of his book right over here that he'll be happy to sign, and that'll be immediately after this evening's conversation. The conversation will be about 40 minutes long, and then at about 7:45, Julia will ask, are there any questions from the audience, and moderate a Q&A session. And we aim to be finishing about 8:15, 8:30, according to where we're at. So it's my pleasure to introduce Julia. Julia Erdlin is in her final year at the Masters of Divinity program at the School of Theology and Ministry, where she coordinates the LGBTQ+ student group Gaudete. She works with high financial needs BC students at the Montserrat Coalition and has served as a facilitator for the PRISM, BC's undergraduate LGBTQ+ support group. Here at St. Ignatius, she previously served as a third grade faith formation instructor and worked with the middle school book club. Michael J. O'Loughlin is the author of Hidden Mercy, Catholics, AIDS, and Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear, which is based on the America podcast series Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church. The Plague series was honored with awards from the Catholic Press Association, the Religion News Association, and the National LGBT Journalists Association. Mike is also the national correspondent and associate editor at America. O'Loughlin writes and speaks regularly about religion and politics, Catholic young adults, and the role of religion in the public square. He is also the author of The Tweetable Pope, A Spiritual Revolution in 140 Characters. A former staff writer for the Boston Globe and its Catholic site, Crux, his work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and The Advocate. He has been interviewed by a number of media outlets, including NPR, the BBC, ABC, CBS, Fox News, and MSNBC. He frequently gives talks on a range of Catholic issues. He lives in Chicago. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking care of this entire session. Welcome.
Again, thanks for joining us here at St. Ignatius, Mike. Again, it's a wonderful book. I've loved reading it. It made me cry on an airplane, so thank you for that. But really, for those of our audience who haven't yet picked up the book, how would you describe it?
Sure. First, let me thank you for hosting this conversation tonight, Father Jim and the Jesuit Institute, St. Ignatius. I'm looking out. It's wonderful to see some former colleagues at America magazine who are here. Professor Dan Daly, who taught me at St. Anselm, who's on the faculty at BC now. Friends I haven't seen in a while, so thank you all for coming out. As we were driving up, I realized this is not ideal weather for an event, so I'm glad you all made it here safely, and I appreciate it. Sure, so Hidden Mercy. As Father Jim said, it's a book that is based on a podcast we created at America, where my goal was to document stories about how Catholics responded to HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and 90s. And sort of the background was I started reporting full-time about a decade ago, and a lot of my writing tended to be about LGBT issues in the Catholic Church. And a lot of that was because of the news cycle. So this was at a time when the same-sex marriage debate was heating up around the country, and it was in the news a lot, and my job was to collect statements from bishops, talk to Catholics in the pews, what are people thinking about this? This is a major societal change, and let's try to document that. And I was writing a lot about this issue, and I, at the same time, was a little bit worried, what would people think? At the time, I wasn't out, I'm a gay Catholic, and I started to think, yikes, people might start to question why am I so obsessed with this issue, even though it is what's in the news. And I struggled with that for a little bit and felt like this was a very new situation for someone to be in, that this very public conversation about LGBT issues, faith, Catholicism, it hadn't happened before. And I felt like I didn't have people to turn to discuss these questions I had. Did I have a place in the church? Could my personal identity be used to question my objectivity? Lots of kind of difficult questions. And I was talking to a priest friend one night at dinner, kind of telling him this, and he thought for a moment and listened patiently as I ran through all these questions, and decided to tell me a little bit about his ministry as a young priest. He was a Catholic chaplain in Toronto in the 1990s, and he started to hear that there were several students and some faculty who had been affected by HIV and AIDS, whether personally or they knew people. The small gay community really felt like they had nowhere to turn, so he offered the use of the college chapel as sort of a meeting space where they could come together and support one another. He went into details in the stories of how the bishop didn't like what he was doing because it seemed to be lending support to the gay community, and the church was very clear in its opposition to homosexuality. He stood up for the students, stood up to the bishop, was allowed to continue the ministry. And I was surprised by that story because I had known my friend for a while and I didn't know anything about this time in his life, about this ministry. And I was really impressed that he had done this courageous thing at a time when most people didn't do much. And he told me I should maybe consider looking into the 80s and 90s. I was born in the mid-80s and didn't remember any of the height of HIV and AIDS firsthand. So I did what I was told. The priest told me to do something, so I did it. And I spent the next few years reaching out to people like him who had worked in ministry, who hadn't shared their stories yet, and asked them the questions. What was your experience like? What was it like ministering to a community in need? Talking to LGBT Catholics, what was it like to be in a church when your community feels under siege both by society and by the church? And most importantly, and what the goal of the book is, what are the lessons from this time that we need to know as a community? What does the wider church need to know about how it responded? And now I'm out introducing it to people who maybe don't know any of this history either.
And it strikes me from that, just to note that we're sitting right in front of the altar in a church to even have this conversation, which is really something special.
Yeah, this is one of the more imposing settings for one of these talks.
A little bit, but. All right. So you had this first explored as a podcast. So why turn it into this book, this form of the book, and why now?
Yeah, why now is a good question. It hit me pretty early in the reporting process that there were a lot of gaps. There were going to be gaps in the story no matter how much research I did. And that was for two reasons. So one was because of what I'm writing about, a very deadly sickness that happened 30 years ago. A lot of people passed away. A lot of people whose stories would have been helpful to include simply are no longer here and their stories weren't captured. The second thing I realized was every time I interviewed someone, so we'll get into some of the characters I'm sure, but Sister Carol, for example, is the main character in the book, and I'll talk about her story in a bit, but we would finish the interview and she would have these amazing stories and she would inevitably say, and you should have talked to these 3 or 4 people because their stories are even more impressive. They have much more they could have told you, but it's been 30 years and they've passed away. So it occurred to me pretty quickly that we risked losing these stories if I didn't move on them now because people are aging. We've lost a lot of people already. And there does seem to be this moment in the church where I think there's a receptivity to talking about some of this history. And if we don't seize on that opportunity now, who knows what the future holds. So that was my motivation for getting this done now.
Yeah, and you mentioned a little about the research project. What was it like researching such a story that exists in a lot of narratives in people's lives? Was that hard? What was it like to do that?
There were a lot of surprises. I'll say that in my mind, I hadn't known much about HIV and AIDS in the Catholic Church. I had this sort of, what I now know to be a naive understanding that there was sort of the gay rights activist community on the one hand, and then there was the Catholic Church on the other, and they sort of came together and did battle. And I was probably aware of groups like ACT UP in New York and other cities that were kind of in-your-face, really radical protesters who felt like they were fighting for their lives, really, because so much of society had ignored what mostly then the gay community needed in order to survive. And then I knew a little bit that the church had fought against gay rights in the 1980s. One of the most surprising things for me was I had known about the Vatican's condemnation of homosexuality in 1986. I had known a little bit about groups like Dignity being kicked out of parishes. For some reason, I had never made the connection that this was all happening against the backdrop of HIV and AIDS. So I learned that pretty quickly, and the pieces started to fall into place. And at first I thought, okay, there's not going to be too much there. Maybe my friend who did this Toronto campus ministry thing, maybe he was an outlier. What surprised me the most was there were a lot of Catholics, ordained, lay, religious, who were engaged in really meaningful work, but they had to do it under the radar. So kind of unearthing those stories, digging through archives of the National Catholic AIDS Network, for example, at Loyola University in Chicago, where I live, and pulling out a name and going to figure out, are they still around? Would they be willing to talk to me? And then building this web that showed there really was this big network of Catholics doing amazing work at the time and reaching out and hoping they'd talk to me. And I was always moved by the generosity of people who felt like their stories hadn't been captured and felt like they hadn't been asked to share them in decades.
Yeah. And going back to the title, Hidden Mercy, you talked about researching these little pockets. Were those pockets of this mercy kind of connected with one another, or did a lot of people have the sense they were doing this on their own in terms of the Catholic response?
Sure. So let me talk about a couple characters in the book, and that will get to your question about their interconnectedness. So one of the first people I called was a Catholic sister named Sister Carol Baltashevitz. She was a hospital sister of St. Francis, a talented, trained ICU and ER nurse working at a busy hospital up in Wisconsin. And she felt a little burnt out. She was approaching 40. She had been doing this for a few years and needed a break. So Sister Carol talked to her superior, and she moved down to Belleville, Illinois, where she was going to take on some home care nursing. And the idea was it would give her a little bit of a break, let her think about what she wanted to do next. And she did that for a little bit, and in the book I go into some of the surprises that she encountered through that kind of nursing, how it was different from the ICU and ER nursing. But she, over the course of a couple months, was assigned to younger patients, which wasn't what she was expecting for home care nursing. And generally, they were young men who had moved out from this small town to the coast and then moved back home and had to tell their parents three things: that they were gay, that they had AIDS, and that they were dying. And Carol was frustrated because as a nurse, she was used to healing people. That's what she did. That's what she was good at. And at the time, this is 1985 or so, there was nothing she could do. There was no medical treatment. She could treat pain and try to keep people comfortable, but that wasn't enough for her. So she decided she had to learn how to do more. What could she do to help these patients, really, not even a community yet, just these patients she encountered once in a while. She eventually realized there wasn't enough education where she lived down in southern Illinois, so she and another sister, Sister Mary Ellen Rombach, they approached their superior and asked if they could move to New York City for 6 months, where they would volunteer on the AIDS wards of 2 Catholic hospitals. They worked on an AIDS hotline. They volunteered with Gay Men's Health Crisis. They really immersed themselves in the gay community and said, we want to help, but we need to learn what it is the community needs. She eventually, if you read the book or you've listened to the podcast, she moves back home to Southern Illinois, and she opens an organization called Bethany Place, which really grows into one of the largest HIV and AIDS resource centers in that part of the country. So you had this small town Catholic nun, which is how she described herself, really transforming into an ally for the gay community in the 1980s, sort of a surprising story. It wasn't until a couple years after I learned her story that I went back to the interview transcripts and realized that she had told me about several other people who I should contact that I didn't do right away. I eventually did, who became main characters in the book, because there really was this sense that because this work was being undertaken kind of away from the spotlight, there was a little bit of risk. It was a taboo ministry when it first started. There was a lot of shame and stigma associated with the community. People were doing the work, but they had to learn from one another in a kind of, shadowy is not the right word, but in a subdued way. And even though Sister Carol spent most of her life in the Midwest, she connected with people in New York, She went to conferences that the AIDS organization hosted in San Francisco. So there was this Catholic network that, for various reasons early on, just didn't feel comfortable being out in the open about their work.
Yeah, I was not surprised at all listening to the podcast and reading the book that, of course, a Catholic nun is one of the central characters. Tracks with all of the ones I've ever met of her brave work. So yeah, talking about all these people you met, what was maybe something you learned or a story you heard that didn't quite make it into the podcast or book that you want to share?
I'll tell you this story because it just happened last night, so it's fresh.
Wow.
So in the book, I write about a young Jesuit priest named Father William Hart McNichols, who had moved to New York City to study art. His goal was to produce religious art that would help evangelize. So he had produced illustrations for children's books. He was looking at how we could use art to evangelize culture, basically. And he arrived in New York in the early 1980s. The goal was to get more education, learn how to be an artist. And it was pretty early when he was there that a local chapter of Dignity approached him and asked if he would celebrate a mass for people with HIV and AIDS. And he was a little hesitant at first because he knew that if he were to get involved in that ministry, two things would happen. One, it would overtake his life because he was aware of the great need for spiritual care for this community. One of the things that was really sad about this was the community being affected was mostly young men who were forced to confront questions of mortality in their 20s and 30s. Most people think you'll have a few more decades before you have to think about that kind of thing. And as they were confronting questions of what does it mean to die, they were cut off from their spiritual communities because they didn't feel welcome in their churches. And Father Bill recognized that and thought that if he were to respond to this invitation, he would be called to help the community in need, and it would overtake his life, and he might be forced to give up some of his art. The other thing was he knew that any men who were engaged in HIV and AIDS ministry at the time were labeled gay, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to be a publicly gay priest. But he really grappled with this question and eventually decided that he would accept the invitation, which helped launch his own work as a priest involved in HIV and AIDS care. So he's one of the characters in the podcast and in the book. And I write in the book about this candlelight vigil that was held at Fordham University in New York in the 1980s. It was a way to call attention to the ongoing HIV and AIDS crisis in New York City, and they used some of Father Bill's art in a special Stations of the Cross he had created. So he took the images and the stories of the stations and sort of reinterpreted them through the lens of someone being diagnosed with HIV, the various trials that they would encounter during the progression of their disease into AIDS and their eventual death and resurrection. And it was this powerful experience. I talked to some people who were at the vigil. They talked about how it helped raise their own understanding and awareness about HIV and AIDS through a spiritual lens that maybe hadn't been available to them before. And it's a short story in the book toward the end of it. And last night, I was giving a talk at Sacred Heart University down in Connecticut, and at the question and answer session, a man stood up and told me he had just finished reading the book last night, the night before the talk, and he said it was difficult to get through that story because he had actually been a student at Fordham when this vigil was taking place, and from his dorm, he was able to see the candlelight outside, and he remembered that he was too ashamed to go. He was a closeted gay Catholic 18-year-old, and he wanted to go show support. He was afraid of HIV and AIDS himself, convinced that he would die from this, is how he put it last night. And he wanted to go show support and solidarity with the community, but he was too afraid to show up to the vigil. He said the shame and stigma was so great that he was afraid that even looking out the window, someone would look up at him looking out and say, why is he looking at that vigil? He must be gay. So a completely different perspective to Father Bill's story, but another reminder of how anyone who lived through that time and was at all attuned to the situation has their own unique story. And his story, he said, hasn't been told or captured. So I think that this book, that Hidden Mercy and the Plague podcast, I hope is starting a conversation and encouraging people to jot down their own stories. One of the interesting things about giving these talks is inevitably there'll be people in the audience who lived through this time and who could be up here giving their own deeply moving testimony about this. So I hope this is the start of many surprises that come from people reading the book.
What a gift to hear his story.
Yeah, it was really a powerful moment.
Thinking of the time of then and the time of now, you were working on this book and you're touring this book during another very different pandemic as well. What has that been like, sitting with these characters in the past and the present moment?
Yeah, I asked some of the characters I wrote about some of the people I wrote about in the book, their thoughts on that, and they really struggled with that, to compare the two too closely. And one big difference was early on in the HIV and AIDS crisis, it became pretty clear how HIV was spread, and that it wasn't airborne, that it required pretty intimate contact, that it was safe to be around people who were HIV positive. And there was a lot of misinformation. I mean, that's a parallel we see today, but it did allow people to step up and help. Most people chose to do nothing. Some people chose to make life harder for people with HIV, but in the book, I profile a number of people who stepped up and did the right thing. Of course, at the beginning of this pandemic, the way you could help was to stay home, so there wasn't necessarily that same parallel between the two. I will say, one of the, I tend to focus on the more inspiring stories in the book, against the context that I'll talk about at another question, but there was this sort of movement in Catholicism, certain parts of Catholicism, that tried to undermine public health campaigns in the 1980s. So there was a consensus pretty quickly that using condoms to fight the spread of HIV was one of the best tools available at the time. And there were some church leaders, some bishops, some Catholic organizations who said no, because of the church's ban on artificial contraception, condoms would not be a licit way to fight the spread of HIV either. So there's something, I haven't worked it out yet, there's some parallel about undermining public health campaigns that we're seeing some of that today with some church leaders who are skeptical of vaccines, skeptical of various other public health measures. But thankfully, of course, with this pandemic, we have the Pope, who has been a big champion of vaccines. So better in some ways, but some of the same unfortunate strains continuing to today.
And thinking about, because of who you just mentioned, who did you anticipate would be the audience for either the podcast or the book? Has anything surprised you about the reception?
That's a good question. Has anything surprised me about the reception? So there's, of course, an audience of people who lived through this time, and the number of messages I've received from individuals sharing their stories has been encouraging. That began with the podcast when it came out in 2019. But I really am hopeful that people who don't know this history, who were too young to live through it, will be able to glean some inspiration or encouragement to remain in the church. Of course, in my book, much of the focus is on LGBT issues because of how HIV and AIDS affected the gay community. But I know it's not easy for anyone to be Catholic. It's a very complicated institution, and there are lots of different ways people might not feel welcome. So I hope through the stories that people will find a way to see that there is an opportunity to remain and to contribute and to be part of this vibrant institution. One of the real blessings for me has been, as a reporter, getting to call people decades older than me and ask for their experiences and their life story and spend a couple hours getting to know them. And this idea of intergenerational friendships has become a little bit of a passion project for me, because especially in the LGBT community, especially in the LGBT Catholic community, we don't do a good job of passing on this history. I didn't learn any of this as I was growing up through school, in CCD, through my family. And there's this sense that if you don't know your history, this is how one of the people in the book I write about, if you don't know your history, you don't know your identity. And as I was grappling with my identity as a gay Catholic, I felt isolated and alone. And I think part of that is a side effect of this history not being taught. So I do hope that this spurs a conversation about not only this history, but what other history as a church are we not doing a good job of capturing and passing on?
And now you have a book that can be taught at Catholic schools and all of these places.
It can be added to syllabuses and classes.
Yeah, pitch it now. And you talked about this complication of Catholicism. It reminds me of what is my favorite chapter in the book and my favorite chapter title, the Friends of Dorothy chapter, funniest title, about Dorothy Day and her sort of complicated legacy in this story. I think most of us would say we are big fans of hers in this crowd. What was that like to dig into kind of a beloved, radical, recent Catholic?
Okay, so I'm not going to make any assumptions about the knowledge of the crowd. So first, the Friends of Dorothy. was a coded way for gay men in the 40s, 50s, to know if they were, to kind of meet other gay men. Are you a friend of Dorothy? In this case, it was Dorothy, Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland. In my case, in the book, it's about Dorothy Day. So people here know who Dorothy Day is. I assume this parish is very well acquainted with Dorothy Day. But in case anyone doesn't, she leads this Catholic worker movement. She wants to remind the church of its commitment to the poor and the oppressed. She's standing on the side of labor. Her work is happening after the Great Depression. She founded a newspaper to highlight these stories, eventually creates these houses of hospitality where people can come for meals, where they can receive shelter. She becomes a real hero to what today we would call sort of social justice-oriented Catholics. I don't know if that was a term that she would have embraced, but a real icon of a certain flavor of Catholicism. And as I was writing the book, I was thinking of different aspects of the church, how they might have responded to HIV and AIDS, and where I could do research. And in my mind, I thought it would be simple where there would be Catholic worker houses that responded to HIV and AIDS, because it just makes sense. This radical hospitality, this leaning toward the oppressed, and at the time it would be hard to find a community more oppressed than gay men with AIDS in the 80s and 90s. But I was really surprised, actually, by what I found. Like everything else in the book, it's much more complicated than I thought at first. And I found out that Dorothy Day, when she converted to Catholicism, she embraced the totality of the church. So we think of her as someone committed to the church's social justice tradition, which is obviously true, but she was also very committed to the church's traditional teaching on morality. And she really struggled with the question of homosexuality. We know now through an excavation of her diaries that she struggled with this topic, through interviews with family members, that this was something she didn't quite understand and didn't approve of, especially as the number of gay Catholic workers seemed to increase. There was something attracting LGBT people to the movement, and she just wasn't comfortable with it. Now, she died in 1980, I think. So she dies before HIV and AIDS becomes a big public health crisis. So we don't know how she would have responded, and I'm clear about that in the book. But there was this lingering tension in the community, especially in New York. Would Dorothy have wanted the Catholic worker movement to be out front on this issue? It again speaks to this taboo that Catholics working with the gay community, even in HIV and AIDS, that there was something suspect about it, that maybe it shouldn't be happening. And as a result, the Catholic worker movement in New York actually didn't respond particularly heroically. That's what people who were in the movement at the time told me. There's still a lingering sense of, yikes, we could have done more to respond. We were in the heart of the crisis. But that wasn't the end of the story. I discovered a number of Catholic worker houses around the country that did respond well. So I profiled one in Chicago, founded by two former Franciscans who were inspired to provide housing to people with HIV and AIDS. That was a major crisis because there were no legal protections at the time. So if you were diagnosed with HIV, you could be kicked out of your apartment. And as a result, there was a huge housing crisis. So these two former Franciscans opened a Catholic worker house in Chicago by renting a couple of apartments and inviting people to move in and live there. It eventually expanded into a former rectory they turned into a Catholic worker house. In Oakland, California, another Catholic worker does something similar. There was a house that the diocese wanted to open for priests with AIDS, but because of various taboos associated with that, they couldn't find anyone to move in. So he took over and opened a Catholic worker house there. So there were these examples of Catholic workers, in these instances, gay Catholic workers, who were inspired by a woman who had real hang-ups about homosexuality to respond to HIV and AIDS with love and compassion. And there's something about this tension and ambiguity in the church that nonetheless does inspire people to follow the gospel and follow Jesus's teaching to serve those most in need. So it's a very complicated story. Again, back to this naive understanding I had between, it's a battle between the gay community and the church. It's much more complicated, especially on the individual level with someone like Dorothy Day or her followers, or Cardinal John O'Connor in New York, even Sister Carol, who had to overcome her own biases and prejudices. There's something in our faith that I think compels us to fight to overcome biases we might have and ultimately do the right thing.
And thinking of figures in our faith, think of Pope Francis. who's commented on your book and wrote you a note about it. What was that like to have the head of the church have something to say to you in your book, despite the church teaching?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So one of the things that I started this research, I guess shortly after he became Pope, and this phrase kept coming up where people would talk about the individuals they knew who were engaged in this kind of work were Pope Francis Catholics. And this was interesting to me because obviously they were doing this work decades before there was a Pope Francis, but the Pope's image of the church as a field hospital, of being with the suffering, with the hurting, with the wounded, where you don't ask about your cholesterol when you're trying to heal a wound, you instead respond to the situation in front of you. That image kept coming up over and over again as I was doing my research and learning these stories. And as I finished the book last summer, I decided to send him a copy of it, and I wanted to tell him about some of the stories in the book, and I wanted to introduce myself as a gay Catholic, learning about this history, and letting him know that there were people who were inspired by the gospel, were inspired by St. Francis, who looked to the current day Pope as someone who inspires Catholics to continue to do this good work today. And I introduced some of the characters to him in a letter, and he wrote back to me, and he thanked me for sending the book, he thanked me for writing the book, which was very cool, but what was much more moving was he acknowledged that the people I wrote about in the book did this work at great personal and sometimes even vocational risk, that the taboo of working with this community caused some hurt for people. They might have been disciplined by their communities, by their superiors. They might have been talked about, again, this idea that if you were working with this community, there was a secret reason, maybe you were gay or maybe something else was going on. And he acknowledged that, which I thought was very powerful. And then he praised these individuals for doing that work, for carrying out the gospel. And being able to call Sister Carol, Father Bill, some of the lay people I write about in the book, and read them this letter was a really moving experience as a journalist. To hear, not that they felt validated, because they weren't looking for validation, but that they felt seen, and that their stories that they hadn't been able to share over the years was now receiving a wider audience, including to the Pope.
Really special. So you've mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but what do you think this book can be? What do you hope this book can tell the church of right now and moving us forward into the future?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is, it's not an attempt to rewrite history. So I set the context in the book of what the 1980s and 90s were like when it came to HIV and AIDS. And a stat that stuck with me was in 1987, 43% of Americans said that they agreed AIDS might be a punishment from God for people who lived an immoral lifestyle. So that stuck with me because 43% of Americans not only agreed with that, but were willing to tell a pollster they thought that, which is just boggles the mind a little bit when you think today we tried to keep morality out of illness, right? And at the time, that certainly wasn't the case. So the shame and stigma was very true. I also, in the book, write about, again, the Vatican crackdown on groups like Dignity, the effort by many Catholic bishops around the country to fight gay civil rights bills. And that was particularly important because at the time, there were very little protections for LGBT people, and that meant if you got sick, you could be fired from your job and lose your health insurance. So you'd be facing a very expensive treatment when it came to HIV and AIDS. You could be kicked out of your house, and again, this housing crisis that happened. There were no domestic partnerships or certainly no marriage laws at the time, which meant if you did lose your insurance, you couldn't be on your partner's insurance. And you had Catholic bishops around the country fighting these bills, not only in places you might expect, more conservative areas, but even in places like New York and San Francisco. And the church retained a lot of influence there. There's a story in the book about the Archbishop of San Francisco was able to convince the mayor, Dianne Feinstein at the time, to actually veto a gay civil partnership bill. And the church's influence was strong, even in more liberal areas. So I think that is an important context of what's happening here, because I do focus in the book on the more positive stories of individuals who were engaged in HIV and AIDS ministry, but again, against this backdrop of most people doing nothing. And one thing that I hope comes from the book is I asked almost everyone I interviewed and profiled in the book, like, what made you do this? What made you respond in this way? And almost everyone said in one form or another, well, if you had seen what I had seen, you would do the same thing. Anyone would. And that, of course, is not true, because most people did nothing. And I kind of challenged them a little bit. No, like, tell me what made you respond like this. And people answered in different ways. Sister Carol cited the Franciscans, or St. Francis, rather, because she was a Franciscan sister. She cited a saint who had ministered to lepers in Italy in the 12th and 13th century, and she saw people with HIV as modern-day lepers who had been cut off from their family and societies. Nearly everyone cited the gospel as well, that they saw Jesus, he would be standing with this community at the time. And I think that even though this is a very particular subject, it could serve as an opportunity to think, what are the issues today that we could do nothing to respond to? And that would be fine. We have lives to live and we can't respond to everything. But maybe there's something, if we considered our faith and considered our call to respond more actively, more robustly, maybe it could cause us to not worry so much about the societal taboos around a topic, or kind of shake us out of our complacency with life and respond with compassion and mercy, because it's so needed in so many areas.
Thank you. Before we move into our Q&A, is there anything else about the book you didn't get a chance to share? Or
You should be a journalist, because I end every interview with that question. But you were very thorough, so thank you.
all right. Good. Thanks. Well, all right, friends. So we'll move into the Q&A now. I think we have a microphone set up. Is it over there? All right. Give just a second for these. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you could form a line, let's say right over here towards this mic.
Someone has to go first, and then
Someone has to go
inevitably
first.
there'll be more questions. So whoever is brave enough to go first, I thank you. Thank you.
I can project my voice. Can everyone hear me? So, Mike, thank you. That was really, really thorough and really well done. And it seems to me that what your book is doing is showing signs of light and hope in a real dark time. And we're not there on this issue in the church today. It's certainly lighter, not quite as dark. But where are the signs of hope today in the church? There are still big challenges when it comes to gay and lesbian, transgender community, queer persons. So where do you find those signs of hope today? Who are those people? What are those movements? I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes I laugh because if we have a pope who's certainly encouraging dialogue about these issues, but we're still afraid to talk about them, what are we waiting for? Mm-hmm. But luckily, there are signs of hope. Of course, my colleague at America, Father Jim Martin, is a leader on this issue. I know he's a friend of the parish here. And I think when I talk to college students in particular, so a lot of this book tour, so to speak, has been on college campuses, there's almost a sense of certainly learning this history for the first time, but then also it like doesn't even make sense. Like, why wouldn't the church be welcoming to LGBT people when they hold leadership roles in parishes and universities and colleges? So that idea that if it just doesn't make sense, maybe as people kind of, as the generations kind of turn over, that there'll be this understanding that this is where the church would be on it. That's a good question. There are signs for hope, but I think there's sort of still a taboo about talking about these issues. So I hope that just by recalling some of this history, that people will have more freedom, I think, to explore what these issues might mean for us.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. In '93, I was 15 years old, and I was part of a group of kids in Kansas City, Missouri, that would mow lawns for men who were dying of AIDS and HIV/AIDS. And it was kind of sponsored by the parish. This is the school that I went to, like kind of an underground sponsorship. I think looking back, I think maybe the pastor might have also been gay, but it was this underground thing, getting a group of kids from the parish, from the school, to mow lawns, and getting to know the Michaels partners, who both ended up dying of AIDS or HIV/AIDS in very ugly and horrible ways. Now, I haven't read your book, but I have it, so I'm halfway there. But I was curious to know if you mentioned the archdiocese that had the idea for housing for priests who had AIDS. Are there other parishes that you've come across that have done that did work? Because it sounds like there's a lot of individuals that rise up and insert themselves in work that's already going on, or start something that's needed. But I guess just curious about how parishes responded to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Did any parishes respond in a robust way? And I'm certain that some did. In the book, I profile Most Holy Redeemer Parish in San Francisco. And it's a fairly well-known parish today. It's right in the middle of the Castro, the gay neighborhood in San Francisco, and has a thriving LGBT ministry, a thriving parish all around. And one of the interesting things I learned about the parish's history was I kind of saw it as inevitable that if you had this Catholic church in the middle of the Castro, of course it would respond well to HIV and AIDS. And I quickly was disabused of that there's never anything inevitable about a Catholic institution responding well on an LGBT issue. It takes a lot of hard work and determination from Catholics, all kinds of Catholics, really. And in Most Holy Redeemer's case, the parish was actually very much on the skids, as the former pastor put it to me. And a lot of the neighborhood had cleared out. It was gentrifying. It was becoming a gay hub in the 70s and 80s. And sort of the old guard of the parish had kind of let the parish collapse a little bit. And a new pastor came in and said, a job of a parish is to serve its community, and we're not doing that because the community now is filled with gay men, and we're still kind of just struggling to get by with the few remaining older parishioners we have. So it was a series of commitments from the parish to reach out to the local community. It helped revitalize the parish, invited the gay Catholic community in, and this was all happening just before HIV and AIDS really hit San Francisco hard. So at that point, it was set up to respond well, and the parish created a hospice across the street in a former convent. It created a buddy program where it did things similar to what you mentioned, grocery shopping or cleaning, cooking, kind of the things that you can't do if you're sick. It created a support group that provided spiritual care to people with HIV and AIDS. And that was very much a parish response. I won't say it's unique, but I didn't come across a lot of parishes that kind of made that their identity in the same way. But I'm certain that, especially in big urban centers, there were parishes that took this on. One of my favorite stories in the book is at Most Holy Redeemer, one of the goals of the pastor who was leading the church at that time was to integrate the parish, to make sure that there wasn't sort of a LGBT side and then the traditional parishioner side. He wanted them to come together, and one of the ways he did that was by encouraging the way he describes them was like these old Italian grandmothers who had time to cook meals that were then brought to mostly young gay men suffering from HIV and AIDS. And that was very much a parish response, and I'm sure there's similar stories, and I look forward to learning them as I continue to do these talks.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I use the podcast in a class I teach here at BC on Christian ethics and HIV/AIDS, like Jim Keenan, and I look forward to using Hidden Mercy as well. I was reflecting on about 15 years of teaching that class at a couple different Jesuit campuses, And as you might imagine, it has brought up issues for my students every single time.
If you're comfortable, do you mind lowering your mask?
Oh, not at all.
Okay, thank you.
Can I continue,
having a
or
hard
did you
time
miss
hearing.
everything? Should I just keep going or
Yeah,
start
yeah,
over?
yeah.
Okay. So I think in thinking back over these classes, and as, like you, students who didn't live through the 80s and 90s kind of came to learn this history, I think early on my students maybe would come to office hours to figure out, how can I be Catholic in light of my sexuality or gender identity? Today, more often, I fear I have students saying, why would I remain in a church that doesn't allow me to live with integrity? So I guess my question is like Dan's, not just what signs of hope, but like what would you say to young Catholics today who are really wrestling, but through your research, maybe you see signs of hope and reasons to stay?
Yeah, so signs of hope for young people who don't even consider maybe joining or staying part of an institution that doesn't embrace who they are. That was something that sort of I thread throughout the book as well, is asking people, why did they stay in the church? Especially lay people who maybe protested the church and ultimately stayed, or some people who left. Why did you leave? What was it that did it for you? And in the book, there's a number of models. Some people say that they find a parish that's welcoming, kind of tune out the rest. I asked them about what they think about what the book said about A, B, and C, and they have no idea because they don't care. Other people say that it's their home and they're not going to be kicked out of it, and that's a position I understand, but it's certainly, this is like more than a club that you don't want to be kicked out of. There's something deeper going on here, so that didn't quite work for me. And I kept searching and asking these questions, and ultimately I learned it is a very personal decision, but a thread that wove its way through all the answers was, you have to decide that you want to be part of this institution and recognize that it will be challenging, but understand that once you make that decision, you have to be committed to it. And it's not the most satisfying answer, because sometimes it's maybe not healthy to remain in the institution if it's really not working for you. But once you make that decision, I think you have there's rights and responsibilities that come with baptism, right? And there's responsibilities to be part of the institution in a meaningful way. So I hope that through these stories, people will feel like they have allies, even people who have come before them, but then really stay committed and offer the gifts. There's one individual in the book who I write about who was raised in a very Catholic family. He moved to New York, came out, joined ACT UP, was really torn because he kind of loved his childhood faith even though he had left, but at the same time was a radical activist who saw HIV and AIDS killing his friends and eventually his partner. And a very talented guy, his name's Sean Strube, he wrote a memoir about HIV and AIDS as well, but a very talented guy who contributed a lot to the fight against HIV and used his marketing power and his sort of PR power to do a lot for ACT UP and the organization. And I just thought it was so sad that he felt like he didn't have a place in an institution that had meant a lot to him as a young man. And there's countless people like him who were driven away from the church. And imagine the gifts he could have offered this institution had he been made to feel welcome, had church leaders maybe listened to the community instead of driving them away. So I hope that people feel like they have allies through this history, and then once they've made that commitment to stay, can weather the hard times more easily.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk. Thank you for your book, Mike, and your ministry. Thank you, Julia, for the conversation. I wondered, was so moved, I think, by your prophetic call to the church today to look at the issues that we as a community, we as a church might look back on and say, oh, we could have done more, as you were describing the Catholic worker movement in New York. I wonder, though, about HIV and AIDS hasn't gone away. Of course, it's much different now, and there are so many kind of real sort of medical advances that have allowed for people who are positive, HIV positive, for it not to be a death sentence for them. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what Catholic HIV or AIDS ministry looks like today, or if that's not something that you already know about, what might it look like, or what could it look like?
Yeah, so what does HIV and AIDS ministry in the church look like today? I will say, look, this book is history, so I'm not expert on this subject, but a couple things come to mind. I had also known early on in this research that the Catholic Church globally is one of the leaders when it comes to HIV and AIDS medicine or outreach around the world, and that was kind of a surprise, like, given the difficulty that the church had early on, how did it transform into this? So there is a lot going on around the world. In this country, it's a little different. I think almost all the ministries I write about in the book that were started by Catholics in the 80s and 90s have either transitioned into becoming secular organizations once the founders stepped away, or they've shut down. And a lot of that is because of the really miraculous advances in medical care that have kind of changed what an HIV diagnosis means today. One unique or surprising ministry that stuck out to me was at Most Holy Redeemer in San Francisco, where the AIDS support group had kind of gone away as society moved on from the crisis for various reasons, but a big reason was it wasn't a death sentence anymore, like you said. But in recent years, the organization has reformed because long-term survivors of HIV were facing new challenges with aging. One of which really stuck with me, that they don't have the networks of longtime friends because so many of their friends had died decades ago, and now they're facing these challenges with aging, with loneliness, isolation. So they've reformed the AIDS support group that they thought was all done, that they hadn't needed it before. So I wonder if there's opportunities for things like that. And then at the end of the book, I note, like you mentioned, that HIV and AIDS is still an ongoing crisis. It's tempting to think of it as history because of those medical advances, but tens of thousands of people in the US are diagnosed with HIV every year, predominantly gay men of color. And I wonder, is there something about the demographic that's most affected today that's caused the church to step back? And if so, we could reflect on that, and maybe there are opportunities for ministry going forward.
Michael, thank you for the podcast and the book. It's kind of hard to imagine being in div school without the podcast when I was working in ministry before being here. So we're at this moment, with the gay community, and I use that word specifically, gay, lesbian, bisexual, where there's a bit of a detente and the church is in dialogue. But to my eyes, it's like we're experiencing these same kinds of responses between the institutions of the church and transgender individuals. What, from your experiences, what perspective would you offer to an audience, of those of us who are in the church, maybe feel pain seeing, these series of responses to the transgender community, and what might we, offer as a word of help?
Yeah, so what responses might the church, or to this ongoing question about how to welcome trans people into the church? So a quick story that comes to mind is St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, which is this Catholic hospital that became legendary for HIV and AIDS care. Again, this, in my mind, perception that it was inevitable because you have this Catholic hospital in the middle of Greenwich Village where it was really the epicenter of the HIV and AIDS crisis in New York. Of course, it would respond compassionately and create one of the finest AIDS clinics in the world. But of course, it wasn't inevitable. And one of the lessons that stuck with me from that, though, was there was a targeting of St. Vincent's by ACT UP in the 80s when they found that some staff were disrespecting their gay patients for a variety of different episodes that had made their way through the gay community. They held a big protest in the waiting room and desecrated a crucifix, really angry at the institution, at the hospital. And I swear this is going to answer your question. The Sisters of Charity of New York, who ran the hospital, had the opportunity to call the police and press charges to kind of bolster security to make sure the activists didn't get in. They could have kind of doubled down on, we're a Catholic institution, so we have certain rules that we go by, and if you don't like them, you can get healthcare somewhere else. But instead, the sisters engaged with the community. They invited the protesters in and said, what is it we aren't getting? What are the needs of your community? What don't we understand? Obviously, there's anger here. Why is that, and what can we do better? And It took a couple years, but it really did transform into one of the premier HIV and AIDS clinics in the world. Was leading clinical trials. It was really a robust ministry, but it was never inevitable. So I think on these issues where maybe there's not as much experience, listening could be a hugely important way forward on this. Whether it's the church hierarchy who is tempted to release statements because it is something that's in the news a lot, or just parishes who aren't sure, what does this mean for us? This is something that feels very new. I think engaging with the community and listening, what are your concerns? What would you like from the church? What can we do better? And that kind of intense dialogue, which I think the Pope is calling us to as a church, could yield some fruitful results.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk tonight. We had a question from someone online. Catherine asked, were there any obstacles that you faced from the church in telling these stories?
Any obstacles I faced from the church in telling these stories? I have to say, not many. My colleagues in America were incredibly supportive. When I pitched this idea, I said, I want to make a podcast about the church's response to AIDS, and I want to talk about being a gay Catholic, and I know I'm your national reporter, but I think this is something we should do. It was kind of crazy. I mean, it was a lot to ask of them, and they were supportive every step of the way. So that was one opportunity where there could have been some pushback, and there really was simply encouragement. So I'm grateful to the Jesuits at America who supported this project from the beginning. And then, no, I mean, I think there's something about this topic that this has surprised me with the reception of the book, that has sort of transcended even the traditional polarized church that we find ourselves in today. I've been surprised that there's been a reaction from liberal Catholics who are glad to know some of this history, from conservative Catholics some of whom did really great work at this time. They might not be on board with some of the other questions I asked in the book about identity, but there was this sense that responding with mercy and compassion, it wasn't a liberal or conservative thing at the time. And I've been impressed with that, and I'm hopeful that this can continue to kind of build bridges with different communities in the church.
From this audience or online?
So once again, thank you very much, and thank you, Julie, for leading. I'm curious, and this might be really an awful or even just exhausting question to think about, but because I know it's been asked of you before. I know you've already received so many stories after the fact, after the podcast has already been released, after the book has already been released. So part of me is wondering what might be next. As you continue to hear stories, as you continue to collect new stories, do you see perhaps future versions of the podcast, book, or even other avenues for people to continue to share these stories with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know what's next. I'm kind of tired. So I think I need to sit with this for a while. I would love to see something. This is like, I usually have answers to all the questions prepared in my head. This is not one I have, but I think that there is so much robust material from this time. I would love to see a broader effort to collect some of it. I'm very clear in the book that this is not a definitive history of this time. I'm not a historian. This is simply a snapshot of different responses to HIV and AIDS. I think if there were an organization or a person who could devote more time to really capturing these different stories from around the country, maybe around the world, I only was able to kind of scratch the surface of what's there. And inevitably, anywhere I go to give talks, I will hear like 5 more stories I wish I had been able to include about a heroic sister who responded, this is a real one, in Utah. She created this kind of underground ministry out there, and I just didn't know about it and couldn't write about it. But there's so many stories, and I wish that there could be a bigger attempt to kind of collect them together and preserve them before it's too late. So if any Jesuits want to sponsor a new ministry collecting these stories, we can chat.
I want to echo the gratitude for Julie and for you as well. This may or may not be related to the book or the podcast. You have self-identified several times tonight as a gay Catholic specifically, not just one or the other. What is your favorite part about being a gay Catholic? What part of that specific intersection in your own life brings you consolation and joy?
Wow. So as a reporter, I don't write about myself very often. And in the book I do. If anyone's read the book, you know that. And that was because an editor I had said, you need to write about why you're writing this book, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So I did. I'm still not comfortable with it. So I don't have a good answer to that. I'd have to think about that. And I usually do leave talks with one question that sticks with me that I did not have a good answer for, and I will think about it over the next several days and then hopefully come up with something. But yeah, thank you for asking.
Well, thank you again for writing this book and for being with us tonight.
Thank you for the great question. I appreciate it.
So we'll move over to book sales and signings. Sound all right?